On the last Saturday of April in 1869, Temperance Fuller counted 6 silver coins one at a time into the palm of the county estate agent, while behind her the fieldstone walls of a dead woman's springhouse sagged inward under a roof that had caved in 2 winters before, and beside it a cracked oak churn lay tipped on its side in the weeds, like something already given up for dead. Newell Bragg, who ran 40 cows and owned the only icehouse in the township, laughed so hard at the sight of it that he had to catch himself on his wagon wheel and told every man still standing in the trampled dooryard that the widow Fuller had just paid good money for a hole full of rubble and rot. A few of the men laughed with him because that was easier than not laughing, and one of the Kessler boys pointed at the sunken roof timbers with the frank delight of a child watching something fall down for sport. The estate agent, a narrow, patient man named Corbin Ray, who had spent the whole cold morning settling what remained of Prudence Alcock's affairs, only folded the 6 coins into his ledger book and said that a bargain was a bargain, and that he for one would rather see the old Alcock Spring lot go to somebody than sit unclaimed through another township tax season. Tempy did not look at Bragg. She had learned in the 11 months since Amos died that there was a particular kind of silence that cost a man his amusement faster than any argument could, and she gave it to him now, standing straight in her gray wool with her bonnet strings untied and her chin level, while the April wind came down off the ridge smelling of thawed mud and last year's leaves. Amos Fuller had asked her to marry him in the fall of 1865, the two of them barely 22 and 24, standing at the rail fence of her father's farm with a ring he had paid for out of 3 months' wages, earned splitting rails for a neighbor, and Tempy had said yes before he'd finished the whole of his careful, rehearsed little speech, because she had already decided, watching him work a hayfield 2 summers running, that he was the sort of man who finished what he started and never once complained about the finishing. They married that December and moved on to the 11 acres the following spring, Amos having scraped together through freight work and careful saving just enough to buy the land and the small frame house outright, a fact he was quietly, stubbornly proud of every time he mentioned it, which was not often, because Amos Fuller was not a man given to repeating his own accomplishments. He had been gone since the last week of May, taken by a lung fever that settled into his chest during a wet, late cold snap after a day spent mending fence in a driving rain he'd insisted couldn't wait and never let go of it. Tempy had buried him on a Tuesday and milked the cow on Wednesday because there had been no one else to do either, and she had learned, in the long, silent winter that followed, exactly how much of a marriage's daily labor a person never notices until it is entirely hers alone to carry. The wood split and stacked, the stock fed before light, the roof checked after every wind, the accounts kept honest with no second pair of eyes to catch a mistake. She did not talk about that spring to anyone in the township, not because the grief had healed, but because she had discovered, standing at his grave with the minister's words already fading from her mind, that there was a kind of sorrow a woman could only afford to feel in small private portions if she meant to keep a roof and a fence and a milk cow going through a winter alone. There had been offers, delicately made by well-meaning neighbors, to buy the 11 acres outright and let her go live with her sister's family 2 counties over, and Tempy had refused every one of them with the same quiet, immovable politeness, because Amos had built that house with his own hands, and she was not yet prepared to let anyone tell her what a widow with a paid-for farm was and wasn't capable of managing. She had $2.40 left in the tin box under her floorboard after this, a milk cow named Dinah who gave a middling 6 quarts a day, 4 laying hens, and a house that was paid for outright because Amos, in the 3 years they'd had together, had been careful about that one thing if nothing else. It was not nothing, a paid-for house and 11 acres of decent bottom ground behind it, and Tempy knew better than most of the women standing in that dooryard how many widows in Geauga County were not so fortunate. But a paid-for house did not put money in a tin box, and the 11 acres, planted mostly to corn and a kitchen garden, gave her food and precious little cash, and Tempy had spent the whole of that winter doing arithmetic by lamplight that never came out quite the way she wanted it to. She had not come to the estate sale planning to buy a Springhouse. She had come to see whether anyone would take the old churn off Ray's hands for scrap, because she had heard, the way everyone in a small township eventually hears everything, that Prudence Alcock's butter had once been spoken of clear over in Churn as the best that crossed a counter, and Temperance Fuller had grown up believing that a woman who could make something people wanted to pay for was never entirely without a way forward. She had done the arithmetic on the walk to the sale that morning more than once. $2.40 would not buy a second milk cow, nor even a decent shoat to fatten for the fall, and dividing it further into small purchases, a length of yard goods, a sack of seed corn, the odd tool she genuinely needed, would leave her no better off in a year than she already was. $6 spent on the Springhouse, by contrast, risked everything she had left in the world on a piece of ground 2 seasons of township gossip had already pronounced worthless, and she had known, standing at the edge of the crowd before the bidding even opened, that if she was wrong about the spring, wrong about her own memory of a 9-year-old's slice of bread, she would have nothing left to fall back on at all. She judged the risk worth taking anyway, because the alternative, spending the winter's last coins on small, useful things that solved nothing, felt to her like a slower, quieter way of losing exactly the same farm. Bragg was still talking as the crowd began to drift toward the wagon and the milk cows being sold next, telling anyone within earshot that he'd give the widow a month before she came asking him to haul the rubble off for her at a fair price, since scrapstone was worth more broken down for a foundation than left standing in a shape nobody could use. A woman near the back of the crowd, a stranger to Tempy, murmured to her companion that it was a shame, a young widow throwing good money after a dead woman's ruin instead of saving it, and the companion agreed in the mild, unthinking way people agree with whatever opinion happens to be spoken first. Tempy folded her receipt into her apron pocket, thanked Corbin Ray with a level nod, and walked the short distance up the rutted lane to stand at the edge of what she had just bought, while behind her the auction moved on to livestock, and the laughter, having exhausted itself for the moment, moved on with it. The Alcock place itself, the good bottomland and the frame house and the 11 acres of pasture that actually grew grass a cow would fatten on, had sold whole to a family from Painesville the previous autumn, settled and signed before the snow came. What was left over was this: 2 steep, stony, spring-fed acres set off by themselves on the northern edge of the old farm, ground too broken for a plow and too far from the new owner's barn to be worth fencing in, with the ruined Springhouse sitting on it like an afterthought nobody had bothered to strike from the deed. It had gone unsold at the first 2 offerings. Ray had been prepared, he admitted to Tempy afterward while he wrote out her receipt, to let the county simply absorb it for unpaid taxes rather than keep advertising a wreck nobody wanted, and he told her frankly that she was the first person in 2 seasons of trying to sell it who had so much as walked the ground before bidding. Springhouses like the one Prudence Alcock had built were nothing unusual across that part of Ohio in those years, though a working one in good repair had grown rarer than it once was. The Western Reserve, settled 2 generations before by families come west out of Connecticut and the rest of New England, had proven itself dairy country almost from the moment the first stumps came out of the ground. The rolling hills and abundant spring-fed creeks suiting cattle and grass far better than they suited the corn and wheat that thrived further south and west, and a farm wife's butter and cheese money had become, across the whole region, one of the steadiest sources of hard cash a household possessed, often the only cash that passed through a woman's own hands rather than her husband's. Where a family was fortunate enough to have a spring rising cold and constant on their land, a stone springhouse built directly over it, or beside a diverted channel of it, gave a household something no root cellar dug into ordinary earth could match: a temperature that held steady through the worst of any summer, regardless of drought or heat wave, because the water feeding it had spent months underground at a temperature the sun never touched. Such springs were not common everywhere, and a farm without one relied instead on deep wells, packed ice cut from a pond each winter and buried in sawdust to last the summer, or simply the patient acceptance that summer butter would never quite equal what a winter or spring churning could produce. Tempy had grown up hearing this spoken of as plain fact, the way people speak of weather or soil, without anyone troubling to explain that it was, at bottom, a matter of simple physics dressed up as good luck. Cold applied early and kept applied without interruption was worth more to a dairywoman's fortunes than almost any other single advantage a piece of land could offer her. Tempy had walked the 2 acres alone the week before the sale, without telling anyone, climbing over a fallen rail fence in her second-best boots to stand where the spring came out of the hillside in a slow, cold, unhurried braid of water that had clearly been running long before anyone built stone around it and would go on running long after the stone fell down entirely. She remembered, standing there, being 9 years old and riding behind her father to the Alcock farm to trade eggs, and being handed a slice of bread with butter on it that tasted like nothing she had ever eaten before or since, sweet and clean and faintly nutty, and her father saying on the ride home that Prudence Alcock's butter kept fresh through August, when every other woman's dairy in the township had gone soft and sour by the middle of July. Her father had said it the way a man says something he half believes is a small local legend, the sort of remark that gets repeated at church suppers without anybody troubling to ask why it was true. Prudence Alcock herself, Tempy had gathered, piecing together fragments over the years, had come out from Connecticut as a young bride sometime in the 1820s, had outlived 2 husbands and raised no children who lived past infancy, and had spent the better part of 40 years running her dairy alone with the help of hired girls who came and went, becoming, by the time old age finally slowed her, one of those fixtures of the township that everyone respected and almost nobody actually visited. There was a story, told to Tempy once by an aunt who had it third hand, that a steamboat captain running the lake trade out of Fairport had once come 12 miles inland specifically to buy Prudence Alcock's print butter for his own table, and had paid her double the going rate without argument because he'd tasted nothing like it between Cleveland and Buffalo. Whether the story was strictly true or had simply grown taller with every retelling, Tempy had no way of knowing, but she had noticed, walking the 2 acres with her hand still cold from the spring water, that nobody in the township seemed to connect the legend of the butter with the plain stone building the legend had actually come out of. She had died the previous winter at past 80, in the frame house that had already been sold away from the Springhouse lot by the time the estate went to auction, and the roof of the Springhouse itself, Tempy learned from Ray, had caved in the winter before that, under a heavy snow that Prudence, by then too frail to climb the hill and see to it herself, had never been able to have repaired. Nobody, not her father, not Bragg, not the county agent scribbling in his ledger, seemed to remember, standing in that dooryard, that a woman's whole reputation for the finest butter 3 townships could produce had been built on nothing more mysterious than this collapsed pile of stone and the water still running quietly beneath it. Tempy remembered it perfectly. She had put her bare hand into the spring water that ran through the collapsed Springhouse floor and held it there until her fingers ached with cold, and she had understood, the way you understand a thing all at once instead of piece by piece, that the ruin everyone was laughing at was not a hole full of rubble at all. It was a cellar full of winter that never stopped being winter, sitting 2 miles from a township where every other dairywoman's butter turned to grease the moment the weather warmed, and it was hers now for $6, 4 crocks, and a cracked churn thrown in because Ray hadn't known what else to do with them. Among the debris she had also found, half buried under fallen shakes, a rusted but serviceable butter ladle and a battered tin skimmer, both clearly Prudence Alcock's own tools left behind when the roof finally gave way, and Tempy had wrapped them carefully in her apron and carried them home as though they were worth considerably more than the scrap value anyone else would have given them. She walked the whole 2 acres twice more that afternoon after the sale, measuring the fallen roof timbers with her eye, counting the soundstones still standing in the walls, and working out, before she had even carried the crocks home in her borrowed wagon, roughly what a load of cedar shakes and a carpenter's week would cost her against the $2.40 she had left in the world. It was not, she knew even then, a sum that left much room for a mistake, and she walked home that evening turning the whole of it over in her mind, the way she had once turned over her father's ledger as a girl, looking for the arithmetic that would make the risk make sense. She hired Ezra Colt the following week, a carpenter of about 40 who had built half the barns and mended half the roofs in the township, and who was known, more than for his skill, for being willing to take butter, eggs, and honest labor in trade when cash was thin, which in the spring of 1869 it generally was for everybody. Tempy offered him what she had, $2 in coin, a promise of butter through the summer once she had any worth naming, and the use of Dinah's stall to store his tools out of the weather while he worked. Ezra had raised an eyebrow at the arrangement, not unkindly, and asked her plainly whether she meant to actually run a dairy trade out of that ruin or simply wanted a tidy stone shed for storing root vegetables, because the 2 jobs called for rather different work, and he charged accordingly. Tempy told him she meant to make butter that kept, the way old Prudence Alcock's had, and Ezra had looked at her for a long moment before saying, in the dry way he had of paying a compliment that sounded almost like doubt, that he supposed somebody had to eventually, since nobody else in the township seemed inclined to try. There was talk, inevitably, about a young widow spending 9 days working alongside a hired carpenter on an isolated stone building at the edge of her property, and Tempy heard a version of it second-hand from Cora Whitfield weeks later, delivered with an eye roll that made plain what Cora thought of the gossips. Ezra himself seemed entirely unbothered by it, being a plain married man of steady habits who ate his dinner at his own table every evening and treated the whole arrangement as no different from any other roofing job. And Tempy, for her part, had decided early in her widowhood that she could spend her limited store of worry on the opinions of the township or on the actual solvency of her farm, but not comfortably on both, and she chose the farm. Ezra walked the ruin with her the first morning, kicking at the fallen roof timbers, running a thumb along the seams of the field stone walls, and pronouncing the stonework itself sound enough, laid by somebody, he said, who'd known exactly what she was building and why. The roof was the whole problem. 2 winters of snow load with nothing underneath to hold it had brought the rafters down across the spring trough, and the debris had dammed the water into a shallow, silted pool instead of the clean, moving channel a Springhouse wanted. They spent the better part of 9 days on it. Ezra cut new rafters from a stand of chestnut on the ridge above, split shakes by hand in the evenings by lantern light, and reset 2 of the foundation stones that had shifted when the roof came down on them. Tempy hauled debris, mixed lime mortar for the repointing, and cleared the spring channel by hand, working her fingers raw, pulling out rotted wood and years of silted leaves, until the water ran clear and cold and fast again over the old stone floor, exactly the way she remembered it running when she was 9 years old with a slice of bread in her hand. Along both interior walls, where the old stone shelving had partly survived the collapse, Ezra built her new shelves of rough-sawn hemlock, set low and wide enough to hold a full row of shallow milk pans, angled just slightly so any spilled milk would run toward the drain channel rather than sit and sour on the wood. He rebuilt the trough itself a full foot wider than it had been, so the spring water ran in a shallow, even sheet across a stretch of flat stone rather than a single narrow channel, giving her far more cold surface to set crocks and pans against. And he cut a second, narrower shelf nearer the trough itself for ripening crocks, close enough to the moving water that the stone beneath them stayed reliably cold even on a warm afternoon. He built her a plain plank door with a good iron latch, Because, he told her, a springhouse that any wandering dog or raccoon could nose open through the winter was no better than the ruin she'd started with, and he set a small louvered vent high in the gable end so the damp air inside could breathe without ever letting warm outside air pool at the ceiling. The cracked churn was Ezra's second project. It was a tall oak dash churn, barrel-shaped, banded in iron, with a long-handled dasher meant to be worked up and down through a hole in the lid, and the crack ran the length of one stave where the wood had dried and split from years of standing empty in the weather. Ezra had asked her, before he began the repair, whether she wanted him to build her an entirely new box churn instead, a newer style just beginning to be sold through the Cleveland catalogs, worked by a crank rather than a plunging dasher and said to be considerably less tiring on the arms. Tempy had considered it and declined, partly because a new churn would have cost more than she could then spare, but partly, too, because Annalie Sump had told her plainly that Prudence Alcock had always distrusted the crank churns for anything but the largest batches, believing a dasher worked by hand let a careful woman feel, through her own arms, exactly the moment the cream's resistance changed and the butter began to come, a sensitivity she doubted any gear and crank could fully replace. Tempy found, once she had churned enough batches to trust her own arms the way Annalie described, that she agreed with the old woman's judgment, though she allowed, privately, that a crank churn might make good sense for her someday, once the volume of cream she was handling outgrew what one pair of arms could reasonably manage. He soaked the whole barrel in the mill pond for 4 days to swell the wood back tight against its hoops, then drove the iron bands down fresh and snug with a wooden mallet, and pared the crack with a hot iron and beeswax until it held water without weeping a drop, testing it twice by filling it to the brim and watching the outside of the stave for the better part of an afternoon before he'd pronounce it sound. By the time the roof was shaked and the spring trough rebuilt with new stone shelving along both walls, Tempy had spent $2.75 on nails, lime, and cedar shakes from the mill in Chardon, on top of the $2 in coin and the promise of summer butter she'd paid Ezra outright, and she had a fieldstone springhouse standing square and tight over a spring that ran a steady 50-some degrees no matter what the thermometer nailed to the porch post said about the weather outside it. She stood in the doorway on the last evening of the work, listening to Ezra pack his tools, and thought that $6 and 9 days of another person's patient labor had bought her something the whole township, laughing in that dooryard, had entirely failed to see. What Tempy did not have, that first week the springhouse stood finished and empty, was any real idea how to use it properly. She had grown up around dairy work the way most farm daughters had, skimming her mother's crocks and turning the family churn on wash day. But the particular knowledge that had made Prudence Alcock's butter worth talking about clear in Chardon had died with the old woman, and there was nobody left in the township willing to teach a young widow the finer points of a trade that most of them assumed any competent farm wife already knew. So Tempy did what she had always done since Amos passed, and left her managing 11 acres and a milk cow alone. She asked careful questions of anyone who might know something. She watched, and she kept a ledger. She learned the most from an old woman 2 farms over named Annalie Sump, 71 that spring and still keeping a single Jersey cow herself, who remembered Prudence Alcock well enough to describe her methods in fragments over a Sunday visit that stretched, once the two of them got talking, well past the hour Annalie had meant to stay. "The whole of it is cold, and cold started early," Annalie told her, sitting at Tempy's own kitchen table with a cup of tea going lukewarm in front of her. "Not cold at the churn, cold from the very hour the milk leaves the cow and kept cold clean through to the crock. Prudence used to say most women ruin their butter before they've even skimmed the cream, setting warm milk in a warm kitchen and wondering why it won't keep past a Tuesday." Annalie described watching Prudence work as a young bride herself, the older woman's hands moving through the whole long process without a wasted motion, and she remembered, too, that Prudence kept 2 grades of salt on her shelf, A coarse dairy salt for butter meant to be packed and held, and a finer, milder salt for butter meant to be eaten fresh within the week, because the coarse salt, worked in slowly, drew moisture out of the grain in a way the fine salt never quite managed. She used to say the salt does half your keeping for you if you choose the right kind and don't skimp on it, Onali said. But skimp on the washing beforehand and no salt in Ohio will save you. Warm milk set in a warm kitchen, Tempy came to understand, raised a thick cream fast, but it was a cream already halfway to spoiled, carrying whatever heat and whatever souring had gotten into it before it ever reached the churn. Milk set cold, in shallow pans no more than 3 or 4 inches deep, so the cream could rise clean through the whole depth of it, raised slower, over a day and a half instead of a few warm hours. But the cream that came off it was sweet, firm, and honest, with none of the thin, sour taint that plagued every farm wife who kept her milk crocks on a kitchen shelf through July. Tempy set her first pans of Dinah's milk on the new stone shelves the second week of May. Broad, shallow tin pans she'd bought second-hand from Deems's store in Chardon for a dime apiece. 4 of them lined up where the spring's cold breath moved across them steadily from the open trough. She strained the fresh milk twice through clean cheesecloth before it ever touched the pans, once to catch any stray hair or chaff and once more for good measure, because Onali had told her plainly that a springhouse full of the cleanest cold water in the county would count for nothing if careless straining let dirt into the milk to begin with. She skimmed the first pan after 36 hours with a shallow tin skimmer, working the blade just under the risen cream without disturbing the thin blue milk beneath it, and she stood in the cold stone dark of the springhouse, tasting a spoonful of that cream, straight, sweet, and thick as anything her mother had ever raised, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight since the day she'd signed for Amos's grave marker. She learned next that raised cream still wanted ripening before it went into the churn, a controlled souring that most dairywomen managed by simple habit and feel rather than any written rule, letting the skimmed cream stand a day or two in a covered crock at a cool, even temperature until it had developed a faint, clean tang. Not sharp, not sour in the spoiled sense, but rounded and full-flavored in a way that fresh, sweet cream straight off the milk never quite achieved on the churn. Too little ripening and the butter came out flat and pale-tasting, pleasant enough but forgettable. Too much, especially in warm weather, and the cream tipped over into a sourness that carried straight through into rancid butter within days, no matter how carefully it was afterward handled. Onali had warned her about this particular balance more than once, tapping the table for emphasis. "You'll taste it before you can explain it," she said. That's how Prudence always judged it. Not a clock. Her tongue. She used to say a woman who trusted a clock over her own mouth would make consistent butter and consistently middling butter, and she wanted no part of consistently middling. Tempy ripened her first crock of cream for a day and a half in the springhouse itself, tasting it twice with a clean spoon, and on the 3rd morning of May, she worked the mended churn for the first time, standing over the tall oak barrel with the long dasher rod in both hands, driving it up and down in a steady, unhurried rhythm while her shoulders and forearms burned in a way they hadn't since the last time she'd split a season's cordwood alone. The dasher struck the same low, wet slap against the cream with every stroke, over and over, the sound filling the small stone room until she almost stopped hearing it as separate strokes at all, and the cold coming off the spring trough beside her kept the sweat on her arms from ever quite turning uncomfortable, even as the work itself grew harder. Churning, she had been told and now learned firsthand, wanted the cream at a particular temperature, too, somewhere around 60 to 64 degrees, cool enough that the butterfat would separate cleanly into firm grains instead of a soft, greasy mass, but not so cold that the cream simply refused to come together at all. Too warm, and the dasher worked forever without result, the cream thinning and warming further with every stroke until the whole batch was ruined. She learned that lesson in miniature on her very first attempt, Churning nearly an hour passed when she should have before she thought to set the barrel down into the cold trough water itself and let the cream firm back up before trying again. She churned for perhaps 40 minutes more that first morning, feeling the resistance in the dasher change by degrees from the thin splash of liquid cream to a heavier, duller slosh, until quite suddenly the sound changed entirely and small. Pale golden grains began collecting along the dasher rod, roughly the size of wheat kernels, floating in a thin, cloudy liquid that was neither cream nor milk. The butter had come. She stood there a moment with her hands still on the dasher, strangely moved by the plainness of it, by the fact that $6 and 9 days of Ezra's labor and a spring that had been running unnoticed under a pile of rotted timber for 2 winters had produced, in the end, this small, ordinary miracle that every farm wife in the county performed without thinking twice about it. Her first batch, poured off, gathered, washed twice in the cold spring water running right there at her feet, worked lightly with the old wooden ladle she'd found among Prudence Alcock's own debris, and salted by careful guess rather than any measured rule, came to just under 4 pounds. She wrapped 2 pounds in a scalded cloth and carried it to Onally Sump the following day as thanks, and kept the rest for her own table, and it was, by any honest measure, good butter. Not remarkable. Not yet Prudence Alcock's butter, but good, sweet, and clean, and made entirely with her own hands in a Springhouse that 3 weeks before had been a joke told at her expense in a trampled dooryard. Word of a working Springhouse traveled the way most things traveled in a township that size, which was to say faster and less accurately than the truth deserved, and by the middle of May a widow named Cora Whitfield, who kept 3 cows on a rented 40 acres a mile down the creek road, and had neither the cellar nor the patience to manage her own dairy work on top of everything else a widow with 3 cows and no hired help had to manage, rode up Tempy's lane on a borrowed mare to ask a plain question. Cora had heard the Fuller widow had fixed the old Alcock Springhouse and was making butter that held its shape and its sweetness better than anything coming out of the ordinary farm cellars along the creek road that spring. "I've got more cream than I know what to do with and less patience for a churn than any woman ought to admit to," Cora said, sitting her mare at the gate with a directness Tempy liked at once. "What would you take to make something of it for me?" Tempy proposed what dairywomen in that part of Ohio called taking cream on shares, an arrangement old enough that neither of them needed to explain its terms to the other in any great detail. It was, in fact, one of the oldest and most reliable ways a farm household without a proper cellar of its own could still turn its cow's cream into cash, since a churner with the right facilities did the skilled work of ripening, churning, washing, and salting, and took a portion of the finished butter as payment rather than requiring coin up front, a system that suited a countryside where cash itself was often the scarcest thing on any given farm. Cora would bring her cream, skimmed at home from her own 3 cows' milk, to Tempy's Springhouse twice a week. Tempy would ripen it alongside her own, churn it, work it, and salt it, and the 2 of them would split what came out of the churn, 2 parts to Cora for the milk, and 1 part to Tempy for the cold cellar, the labor, and the knowledge of how to turn cream that would otherwise have gone soft and wasted in a warm farmhouse kitchen into butter that actually kept. It was, Tempy understood even as she agreed to it, both a kindness to a neighbor and the first real test of whether what she'd built on 2 worthless acres could scale beyond 1 milk cow's worth of cream. Cora's first delivery came to 9 quarts, carried up the lane in 2 stone crocks wrapped in wet toweling against the mid-May sun. Tempy set the cream on the spring-cooled stone shelves beside her own, ripened it the same day and a half, and churned the combined batch on a Thursday morning that came to just over 11 pounds of finished butter once it was washed, worked, and salted, more than either woman had produced alone in the whole of that first fortnight. Cora took her 7 pounds home wrapped in cloth, tried a slice on bread that evening, and rode back up the lane the following morning specifically to say, standing in Tempy's dooryard with her bonnet still tied under her chin, that she hadn't tasted butter that sweet and that firm since she was a girl visiting her grandmother's dairy in Connecticut, and that she'd bring her cream twice a week for as long as Tempy would have her. It was, in truth, more than a business arrangement to either of them by the middle of that first month, though neither woman said so directly. Cora had lost her own husband 2 years before Amos died, to a fall from a hay wagon rather than any illness, and the two widows found in each other's Tuesday and Friday visits a companionship neither had quite realized she'd been missing. Standing together at the churn or sitting on the stone step while the butter worked, trading small news of the township and, gradually, larger confidences about the particular loneliness of running a farm meant for two people alone. Butter money, Cora liked to say, was the first cash she'd held in her own name since her husband died, and she meant it as something closer to a small private triumph than a complaint, since a farm wife's egg money or butter money had always been understood up and down the creek road, as hers alone to keep and spend as she liked, separate from whatever the rest of a household's accounts required, and a widow with no husband's wages to fall back on found that small independence worth considerably more than the few coins it actually represented. By the last week of May, the pastures along the creek road had come into what every dairywoman in that part of Ohio called the grass. The short, sweet flush of new spring growth that put a particular richness into milk and a particular golden color into cream that no dry winter feed could ever quite match, and that most farmers understood without being able to say exactly why, made the finest butter of the whole year. June grass butter commanded a premium at Deems's store and at every general store from Chardon clear to the lake, not because it was rare, since every dairy in the county was making it at the same time, but because when it was made right, worked right, and kept right, it was simply the best butter a household could put on its table, pale gold, sweet as cream itself, with a texture that spread like something between wax and cloud. The trouble Tempy had already begun to understand from watching her neighbors' habits along the creek road was that June was also the month the weather turned warm enough to undo every advantage the grass had given, and most farm sellers in the township, dug into ordinary earth with no running spring beneath them, could not hold a steady cold temperature past the middle of the month. She had by then taken on a second neighbor's cream, a widow named Ruth Kessler with 2 cows and 4 children and absolutely no time to manage butter-making on top of everything else, on the same 2 parts to 1 part arrangement she'd struck with Cora and her own herd of paying customers, if 4 households could be called a herd, had grown to include the Pettibone family, who kept a single Jersey cow that gave rich, high-cream milk in small quantities, but more than the Pettibones themselves could use. The Pettibones were newer to the creek road than most of Tempy's other neighbors, having bought their small place only 2 years before from a family moving on to Michigan, and their cow, a deep-chested, placid animal named Clover that gave less milk than Dinah but cream richer than any other in the neighborhood, produced more butterfat in a week than the young couple. Still finding their feet on a farm neither had grown up working, quite knew what to do with. Hiram Pettibone brought their cream himself most weeks, a quiet, earnest young man who asked Tempy more questions about the process than any of her other neighbors combined, watching her skim and ripen and churn with the close attention of someone determined to understand a thing properly rather than simply benefit from it. And by midsummer he had built, on Tempy's advice, and largely from her description of Ezra's shelving, a small cold cupboard of his own, set into the shaded north wall of his own cellar. Not a springhouse, since the Pettibone place had no spring worth the name, but cold enough, banked with damp sand, to hold his own household's fresh milk a few degrees cooler than it would otherwise have kept. Tempy was, by the first days of June, receiving cream from 3 separate households twice a week on top of her own, and churning 3, sometimes 4 batches in a single week, standing over the mended dash churn until her shoulders ached and her palms had gone hard and calloused in a way they hadn't been since the spring she'd turned 15 and helped her mother through a bad haying season. She had bought, with the first real money the operation had produced, 6 white ash firkins from the cooper in Chardon at 25 cents apiece, small barrels chosen deliberately in ash rather than oak. Since Jonas Trask, the cooper, explained to her, turning a finished firkin in his hands, that oak's own strong flavor could bleed slowly into butter packed against it for weeks at a time, while white ash stayed neutral and let the butter itself carry the only taste that mattered. Each firkin was meant to hold and keep butter packed down firm and solid for weeks without spoiling, and Tempy bought, alongside them, 2 carved wooden butter prints, stamps that pressed a design, a sheaf of wheat on one and a running deer on the other, into the top of a 1-pound pat of finished butter, marking it as her own work the way a signature marked a letter. The salt itself, she learned early, mattered nearly as much as the wood and the stone. Ordinary table salt, ground fine at a Cleveland refinery, drew moisture out of butter too quickly and unevenly, leaving pockets that never cured properly, while the coarse gray dairy salt shipped west down from the salt works around Syracuse, sold by the pound out of a barrel at Deem's store, worked in slowly and evenly, and helped draw the last traces of moisture from the grain over the following days rather than all at once. Tempy bought her first 10 pounds of it for 20 cents, more than she liked to spend before she had any butter worth salting, and kept it in a covered crock on the driest shelf in the Springhouse, well away from the spring's damp breath, because salt that had gone the least bit damp itself, she'd been warned, salted unevenly and gave a batch of butter a faint bitterness no amount of working could fully wash back out. She had spent, all told since the day of the sale, $9.40 beyond her original $6 on lime, shakes, tin pans, firkins, salt, and prints, and she had entered every cent of it into the marbled ledger in a careful, upright hand, and she told herself, standing over the churn on the first warm morning of June with sweat starting at her hairline, that a woman who kept honest numbers could not be entirely fooled by her own hopefulness, whatever else happened. What happened, in the second week of June, was the honest setback that every trade eventually hands the person learning it, and Tempy's came dressed as simple overconfidence. She had 4 households' cream waiting on a Tuesday, more than she had ever handled in a single churning, and a store order from Deems himself, placed the week before on the strength of the sample she'd carried in, for 15 pounds of prime print butter to be delivered by Saturday. It was the largest order she had been promised yet, and she had spent 2 nights lying awake doing the arithmetic of what it would mean if she could fill it well and keep filling it through the summer, imagining, not for the first time, the particular satisfaction of walking into Deem's store as a supplier rather than a customer counting pennies. She was, for the first time since the Springhouse had stood finished, in a hurry. She skimmed the cream a few hours earlier than she ordinarily would have, before it had fully risen through the whole depth of the pans, telling herself the difference of half a day couldn't matter much when there was so much else waiting to be done. She ripened it in a covered crock set nearer the Springhouse door than her usual shelf, because the ripening shelf by the trough was crowded that week with 4 households' worth of cream at once, and the June afternoon sun, warmer than she'd accounted for, had been striking the stone wall near the door for 2 hours by the time she checked it. The cream had gone further than she intended, sharper and looser than the careful, rounded tang she usually tasted for, and she stood there a moment with the spoon in her hand, uneasy, before deciding she had come too far to start again with Saturday bearing down on her. She churned it anyway because the order was due Saturday, and she did not yet trust herself to waste 4 households' worth of cream on caution. The butter came slower than usual, and when it finally gathered, the grains looked wrong to her even as she worked, smaller and softer than the firm wheat kernel grains she'd learned to expect, more inclined to smear together under the ladle than to hold their separate shape. She was tired, and the afternoon was getting on, and she told herself it would firm up once it was salted and cold, and she washed it in the spring water only once instead of her usual 2 or 3 rinses, because the light was going, and Ruth Kessler's littlest was crying to be fetched home from where the children had been playing at the edge of the pasture, and she worked it lightly, salted it by her usual guess instead of weighing it, and packed 12 pounds of it into 2 of her new firkins and pressed 3 pounds more into prints for Deems, satisfied enough with how it looked in the low evening light to call the day done and go to bed. By Thursday morning, standing in the Springhouse with a knife in her hand to cut a sample for herself before the delivery, she knew before she'd even tasted it that something had gone badly wrong. The butter had a greasy, oily sheen to it that good butter never carried, soft and slick under the knife instead of clean and firm. And when she put a small piece to her tongue, the sweetness she'd worked so hard to preserve had curdled into something flat and faintly rancid, a taste that got worse, not better, the longer it sat on her tongue. She stood there for a long moment in the cold stone quiet of the Springhouse, the knife still in her hand, feeling something close to panic before she made herself set it down and think. 15 pounds promised to Deems by Saturday, and every pound of it, she already suspected, unfit to sell. She thought, standing there, of every dollar the ruined batch represented against a ledger that could not yet absorb the loss comfortably, and for a moment the whole enterprise felt exactly as foolish as Newell Bragg had told the dooryard it was. There was a moment sitting on the Springhouse step with the ruined batch beside her a little later that same morning, when Tempy let herself consider, for the length of perhaps 3 or 4 breaths, simply stopping. She could sell Dinah, sell the tools, let the 2 acres go back to whatever the county wanted to do with them, and spend what little she had left living carefully until something more certain came along. The thought passed through her plainly, without much drama attached to it, the way a genuinely tired person considers the easiest available exit rather than the right one, and she noticed, watching it pass, that it did not actually tempt her the way she might have expected. She had buried a husband and kept a farm running through a winter alone on considerably less certainty than this, and a ruined batch of butter, however humiliating, was a problem with an actual, discoverable cause, which was more than grief had ever offered her. She stood up before the thought could take any firmer hold, carried the 12 pounds of spoiled butter out to feed to a neighbor's hogs, and went back inside to find her father's old habit of ledger-keeping useful for something more than simply recording a loss. She rode to Deems's store herself on Friday, rather than wait for the humiliation to arrive by way of gossip, and told him plainly that the batch he'd ordered had turned and she would not sell it to him, a decision that cost her the $3.75 the 15 pounds would have brought her at his counter price, and that felt, standing in the middle of his store with 2 other customers listening, considerably more expensive than that. Deems himself said little beyond thanking her for her honesty, which she noted afterward in her ledger felt worse, somehow, than if he'd scolded her outright. Word reached Newell Bragg inside of 2 days, the way word always seemed to reach Newell Bragg fastest of anyone in the township, and he made a point of remarking to a knot of men outside the Chardon feed store, loudly enough that it was carried back to Tempy within the hour by 3 separate people, that he'd told everybody back in April the widow Fuller had bought herself a hole in the ground, and here in June she'd gone and proved him right with her own hands. Tempy spent that Friday evening sitting on the stone step of her Springhouse with the ledger open on her knees and the ruin of the week's work still fresh in her mind, working through every step of the batch the way she'd once worked through her father's accounts as a girl, refusing to let the shame of it crowd out the plain, useful question underneath the shame, which was simply what had gone wrong and where. She allowed herself, for perhaps 10 minutes, the plain misery of it, the tiredness in her arms, and the 2 nights of bad sleep and the sound of Bragg's voice carried back to her second hand, and then she made herself stop, because she had learned since Amos died that grief indulged past its useful measure only ate into the hours a person needed for solving the actual problem in front of her. She thought first of the skimming, done too early, and decided that alone couldn't account for a fault this sharp. She thought of the ripening, done too warm and too long in the June sun striking the Springhouse wall, and knew that was part of it. The cream souring past the clean, rounded tang she wanted into something closer to genuinely spoiled before it ever reached the churn. But it was the washing that troubled her most. Turning the memory over and over, the single quick rinse instead of her usual careful 2 or 3. And she understood, sitting there in the last of the evening light with the spring running cold and steady behind her, that buttermilk left working inside the grain of finished butter was itself a kind of slow rot, a residue of milk sugar and milk solids that soured further with every day that passed, and that no amount of salt worked in afterward could fully arrest a decay that had already been sealed inside the butter before the salt ever touched it. She rode over to Onnalee Sump's the following morning to lay the whole failure out plainly, and Onnalee, rather than offering sympathy, asked her a single practical question. Had the rinse water on that last wash run clear or cloudy? Tempy admitted she hadn't thought to check. "That's your answer, then. Whether you like it or not," Onnalee said. "Cloudy water means milk still in the grain, and milk still in the grain means you've packed a slow spoiling straight into every pound, salt or no salt. Prudence used to say she'd rather wash a batch 6 times too many than once too few, because a wasted half-hour of rinsing never cost her a customer, and a hurried batch always eventually did." She learned, turning the failure over with Onnalee that same week, that the trade itself had long since settled on rough grades for exactly this reason. Prime or choice butter meaning the best, cleanest, most evenly worked and salted product a dairy could produce. Good or fair butter meaning something serviceable but imperfect, greasy or grease meaning precisely the fault that had ruined her June batch, and packing stock meaning butter fit only for cooking or for markets too far off to be particular. A dairywoman's whole reputation, Onnalee told her, rested on how consistently her butter earned the first of those grades, rather than drifting toward the others, since a single greasy batch sold under a woman's name could cost her a buyer's trust for a full season afterward, however many good batches had come before it. There was a second lesson buried in the failure that took her longer to name precisely, though Onnalee helped her find the words for it on a later visit. Butter worked too hard, pressed and folded past the point where the moisture had actually been driven out, turned greasy in an entirely different way than butter left too wet, the fat itself breaking down under too much handling until the grain lost its clean, waxy structure and began to smear rather than hold. It was possible, in other words, to ruin a batch from either direction, too little washing and working on one side, too much heavy-handed pressing on the other, and the whole art of it, Onnalee said, lay in learning to stop exactly when the butter told you it was finished rather than a set number of strokes either way. Tempy took to testing a small pat between 2 fingers after every few passes on the butter worker through the rest of that summer, feeling for the moment it turned firm and slightly waxy rather than soft and slick, and she found, the more batches she made, that her fingers came to recognize that moment nearly as reliably as her tongue recognized a properly ripened cream, a kind of knowledge that lived in her hands now rather than in any rule she could have written down for somebody else. Tempy rode home that first evening with the lesson turning over in her mind the whole way, resolved that she would rather turn away an order entirely, the way she had turned away Deem's 15 pounds, than let a single pound of anything less than prime leave her Springhouse carrying her mark. Cold alone, she realized, the very cold she'd built her whole enterprise around, had never been the entire secret at all. It was cold combined with patience and with thoroughness, cream ripened evenly at an even temperature, butter washed again and again in the coldest water available until the rinse ran perfectly clear with no milky cloud left in it whatsoever, worked firmly enough to press out every last trace of buttermilk without overworking the grain into a greasy paste. She had built the cellar right. She had rushed the craft inside it, and no amount of stone and cold spring water could forgive a churner who let herself hurry the parts of the trade that only patience could do properly. She did not touch the churn again until she had walked the whole process through twice more in her head, and once, slowly and deliberately, with an empty crock and a stopwatch borrowed from Ezra Colt, timing exactly how long the spring water took to run properly cold through a rinse basin, set at different points along the trough, and marking in her ledger, for the first time, the precise minutes each step ought to take, rather than trusting entirely to guesswork. The following week's cream, delivered on schedule from all 4 households, she skimmed only after the full day and a half the pans wanted, no earlier, whatever the pressure of a waiting order. She ripened it in a crock, set at the coolest point of the Springhouse shelving, farthest from the door and the afternoon sun, and she tasted it 3 times over the day and a half of ripening, instead of once, learning to trust her own tongue for the exact moment the tang turned from flat to full without tipping towards sour. She churned in the cool of early morning rather than the warmth of afternoon, keeping the cream itself cold by setting the whole churn barrel partway into the spring trough, between strokes when the June air outside crept warmer than she liked. When the butter came, gathered in firm, pale grains that held their shape under the ladle exactly the way her first good batch in May had, she washed it not once, but 4 times, pouring off each rinse and pressing fresh cold spring water through the grain until the water ran as clear as the spring itself instead of clouded white, checking it against a clean glass jar each time the way Onali had described her own grandmother doing. She worked the washed butter on a grooved wooden butter worker Ezra had built her that week, from a design she'd sketched from memory, a broad flat board with a ridged roller that pressed and folded the grain firmly without smearing it, squeezing out the last hidden traces of moisture in long, even strokes until the surface of the butter, cut with a knife, showed no bead of liquid whatsoever. She salted it precisely this time, weighing rather than guessing. A full ounce of fine dairy salt worked evenly through every pound, enough to season it and to help preserve it through weeks of summer heat without tasting of salt at all to an ordinary eater's tongue. She packed the firkin butter down hard and solid with no hollow air pockets anywhere in the barrel, smoothing the top and laying a clean cloth wrung out in strong brine over the surface before she set the lid, and she pressed the rest into 1-pound prints stamped with her sheaf of wheat, wrapping each in fresh cheesecloth. She cut a sample from the finished batch on Thursday evening and tasted it standing exactly where she'd stood the week before, tasting the ruined one. And this time the sweetness held clean and full on her tongue with no shadow of rancid grease trailing after it, firm, cool, and honest. And she allowed herself for the first time since the day at Deems's counter to believe she actually understood the trade she'd bought her way into for $6. The correction held, and it held again the following week and the week after that, until by the end of June, Tempy had settled into a rhythm that felt less like scrambling and more like a trade practiced with confidence. She was receiving cream from 5 households by then, the Pettibones and the Kesslers, and Cora Whitfield joined that month by the elderly Sump household itself, Onali having decided at 71 that she would rather hand her single cow's cream over to somebody who'd clearly learned to do the job right than keep struggling with her own failing hands at the dasher. Tempy churned 4 mornings out of every week now, always in the cool hours before the day warmed, keeping a strict written schedule in the marbled ledger of whose cream had come in, when and how long each crock had ripened, because she had learned in the hardest possible way that a trade built on cold and patience could not survive being hurried twice. She returned 2 parts in 3 of the finished butter to each household on its usual shares arrangement, keeping the remaining third for her own account, and by the last week of June, that third alone came to some 18 pounds a week of firm, well-worked, properly salted June grass butter, carrying her own stamped mark, more than Dinah's single cow could ever have produced on her own account, and more, she suspected, than she would have believed possible standing in that trampled dooryard in April with 6 coins in her hand. A working day at the height of that summer began, for Tempy, somewhere close to 4 in the morning, before the sky had properly lightened over the ridge, milking Dinah by lantern light in the cool damp of the barn, while the hens stirred and grumbled on their roost nearby. She strained the morning's milk and carried it down to the Springhouse before breakfast, checked the previous day's ripening crocks by taste and by eye, and if it was a churning day, worked the dasher for the better part of an hour before the sun had properly cleared the ridge, because she had learned that an hour lost to a late start in July could mean the difference between cream that churned clean and cream that had already begun slipping past its best temperature. Breakfast came after, usually cornbread and whatever eggs the hens had given her, eaten standing at the kitchen window while she planned the day's deliveries in her head. The middle hours went to whatever the season demanded of the rest of the farm, the kitchen garden weeded, the corn checked, mending done, and the household's cream collected on its twice-weekly schedule, carried up the lane by whichever neighbor's turn it was, or fetched by Tempy herself, when a household's own wagon wasn't free. The afternoons, through the worst heat, she spent almost entirely inside the cool stone dark of the Springhouse, washing and working whatever batch had come that morning, packing firkins, pressing prints, scalding crocks and cloths for the next day's use, because the heat outside made any other hour unsuitable for anything requiring patience. Evenings closed with the ledger, entered by lamplight at the kitchen table before she banked the fire and went to bed, usually well past what she would have called a sensible hour, and began the whole round again the next morning, before light. She rode into Chardon on the last Saturday of June and set a fresh 3-pound print, wrapped in clean cheesecloth, on Ansel Deem's counter without a word about the batch she'd turned away a fortnight before. Deems, a careful man who ran the largest general store between Chardon and the Lake Road, and who had heard, like everyone else, about the failed order, cut a sliver from the print with his own belt knife before he said a word, tasted it slowly, cut a second sliver and tasted that too, and looked at her for a long moment before he named a price of 26 cents a pound for as much of it as she could reliably supply through the summer, 6 cents above what ordinary farm butter was fetching at his counter that same week, on the strength, he said plainly, of butter that a man could trust to still be good on the shelf in August. Most of what comes through that door in July, I'm lucky if it lasts a fortnight before somebody brings a spoiled pound back to me, Deems told her, wrapping the print in fresh paper. I'd rather pay a fair price for the kind that doesn't come back. It saves me the argument at the counter, and it saves you the trip out here to hear it. Tempy did not flinch at the number, though it was more than she had let herself hope for riding into town that morning, and she told him, in the same level voice she'd used on Newell Bragg 2 months before, that she could supply him 40 pounds a week beginning in July if he wanted to set the arrangement down in writing, and Deems, after a moment's consideration, said that he did, and the two of them shook hands across his own counter with the standing order written into his order book in his own hand, a copy of the terms torn out and pressed into Tempy's palm before she left, which she folded into her ledger that evening as proof of the first written contract her Springhouse had ever earned her. July arrived with a heat that the whole township agreed, once it had settled in, was worse than any July in a decade, weeks of still, breathless afternoons with no rain and no relief, the creek road baking hard as brick, and the pastures browning off fast once the spring flush of grass had passed its peak. It was, for most of the dairy households along the creek road, a season of quiet disaster arriving in exactly the way disasters arrive on a farm, not all at once, but a little at a time, each household discovering separately and privately that whatever had served well enough through a cool spring simply could not hold through a hot one. Ordinary root cellars along the creek road, dug into common earth without any spring running beneath them, crept up past 65 and 70 degrees by the middle of the month, warm enough that cream ripened too fast to control, and butter, however carefully churned, went soft and greasy within days of being made, exactly the fault Tempy herself had learned to correct in June, except that most of her neighbors had no Springhouse in which to correct it. Word came to her second-hand, the way most news traveled, that Newell Bragg himself, for all his 40 cows and his icehouse packed each winter with sawdust-covered blocks cut from the mill pond, had lost 2 full churnings in a single week when his ice ran out early and his hired girl hadn't the patience or the training to manage the difference, and that the butter he'd sent to Deems's store had been rejected outright at the counter for the same greasy, off-tasting fault Tempy remembered all too well from her own ruined batch. It was not only Bragg's dairy that suffered that July. The Pruitt farm on the far side of the creek lost the better part of 2 churnings to the same greasy fault, and even careful households like the Marsh place, which had managed passable summer butter for years on nothing more than a deep well and good habits, found their July batches turning within a week rather than the fortnight they'd come to expect. Tempy heard about each failure the way she heard about everything, second-hand and a little embellished with each retelling, but the pattern underneath the gossip was plain enough to anyone paying attention. A summer that punished ordinary sellers was, by the same stroke, proving out everything she had staked $6 and a ruined June batch of her own on believing about a spring that never once warmed past 50-some degrees. Deems himself, standing at his counter the second week of July while Tempy delivered her regular Saturday order, admitted without much prompting that he was turning away nearly a third of the farm butter offered to him that month, more than he could ever recall refusing in a single season before, and that customers who had once bought whatever was cheapest at his counter were beginning to ask, specifically by name, whether the Widow Fuller's butter had come in yet. He told her, the second week of August, that he had begun turning customers away from other suppliers entirely, rather than risk another spoiled complaint at his counter, directing them instead, without her ever asking him to, toward whichever Saturday shipment of Fuller's own he still had left on the shelf. Tempy's own supply never faltered. The spring beneath her rebuilt Springhouse ran the same steady, indifferent 50-some degrees in the worst heat of July that it had run in the cold of April, untouched by drought, unbothered by any thermometer nailed to any porch post in the township, and she rose before light 4 mornings a week through the whole brutal month, churned in the cool hour just past dawn exactly as she'd learned to in June, washed and worked and salted with the same unhurried thoroughness that had cost her a ruined batch to learn, and delivered 40 pounds of firm, sweet, keeping butter to Ansel Deem's counter every single Saturday without a single pound turned away. She totaled her ledger at the middle of July, sitting up late one airless night with the window open and moths beating against the lamp glass, and found that between Deems's standing order, her third share returns from 5 households' cream, and a handful of small direct sales to neighbors who had started simply riding up her lane with a coin and a crock. The Springhouse had earned her, since the day of the sale, just over $51 against not quite $14 spent, a figure she read over twice by lamplight before she trusted it enough to close the book and go to bed. The Geauga County Agricultural Society held its summer fair that year on the fairgrounds outside Burton in the first week of August, an event the whole township treated as something between a market day and a holiday, wagons converging on the grounds from every farm within a dozen miles from before sunrise, livestock penned and judged in canvas, roofed pens along one fence line, produce laid out on long trestle tables under a haze of dust and heat, quilts and preserves and pieced coverlets pinned along a rope line in the needlework tent, children running loose between the wagons while their mothers carried covered baskets toward the exhibition halls, and in a plain wooden building set apart for the purpose, the dairy competition that every serious dairy household in the county entered, as a matter of course, whatever they privately thought their chances were. Tempy had debated entering at all almost up until the deadline, uncertain whether a widow 2 seasons into a trade she'd taught herself from fragments and mistakes belonged in a hall alongside families who'd been keeping dairy herds for a generation. But Cora Whitfield had settled the question for her over a cup of coffee in Tempy's own kitchen, pointing out with the plain logic of a woman who had tasted the butter herself, twice a week since May, that Tempy had nothing whatsoever to lose by entering, and a great deal to prove by not being afraid to. "You've already survived the part that would have stopped most people," Cora told her, "which was finding out you could fail at it. Everything after that is just doing the thing you already know how to do." She entered 2 classes, a 1-pound stamped print bearing her sheaf of wheat mark for the fresh butter competition, and a small firkin of packed butter for the keeping butter class. The harder test by far, since the judges for that category were instructed to sample not only the entries fresh on the day, but a duplicate sample held back and tasted again a full week later, precisely to separate butter that merely looked good on a summer morning from butter that actually kept its sweetness the way a household needed it to across a whole hot month. She rode to Burton with Ezra Colt driving the wagon and Cora seated beside her, the firkin and the wrapped print packed carefully in a crate lined with wet toweling against the morning heat. And she spent the ride watching the pastures roll by browner and thinner with every mile, a visible record of exactly the kind of summer that had already broken half the dairies along her own creek road. The fairgrounds themselves, when they finally reached them, were already crowded past anything Tempy had seen since a girl. Rows of wagons parked along the fence line, the smell of dust and trampled grass and roasting corn drifting over from a row of food stands, a brass band tuning up somewhere near the grandstand for the afternoon races, and everywhere the low, constant murmur of a whole county's worth of farm families comparing crops, cattle, and gossip in roughly equal measure. Tempy walked past pens of prize hogs and a ring where a judge in a black coat was working slowly down a line of shorthorn cattle, past tables heaped with squash and early tomatoes and jars of preserves catching the light like colored glass. Before she finally reached the dairy hall, her crate held carefully in both arms, Cora walking a half step behind her the whole way, with the quiet, steady presence of someone who understood exactly how much this particular morning mattered. The dairy hall on judging day was crowded with entries from every corner of the county, rows of butter prints and cheese wheels and crocks of cream laid out under the summer light coming through the high windows, and Tempy recognized, walking the length of the trestle table with her stomach tight, at least 4 entries from households along her own creek road, including, set 2 places down from her own stamped print, a firkin bearing Newell Bragg's own mark, his hired girl's best effort at a keeping butter meant to answer the rumors of his ruined July batches. Among the entries that year was also a firkin from Agatha Pruitt, whose family ran one of the larger dairy operations on the far side of the township and whose butter had, in ordinary summers, taken a ribbon more often than not. This year, by the account of 2 farm wives standing near Tempy in the crowd, Agatha's own firkin had been quietly withdrawn from consideration after the superintendent's assistant, sampling entries the day before, judging to check for spoilage, found it had already begun to turn in the August heat despite 2 weeks in the Pruitt family's below-ground cellar. It was, Tempy understood without anyone needing to say it aloud, the same story playing out across nearly every dairy in the county that summer, families with more cows and longer histories than hers discovering, one ruined batch at a time, that a deep cellar dug into ordinary earth simply could not compete with running spring water when the whole month refused to cool below 80 degrees even after dark. The dairy superintendent that year was a deliberate, unhurried man named Barnabas Careless, who had judged the class for 11 consecutive fairs and was known through the county for tasting an entry 3 separate times before he would commit a ribbon to it. And Tempy watched him work down the trestle table from a respectful distance, cutting a sliver from each print and each firkin, tasting, making a small note in a leather book, moving on, his face giving nothing away to the anxious farm wives and hired girls standing along the wall. The wait between the last haste and the 4 o'clock posting stretched longer than any hour Tempy could remember, and she spent most of it walking the fairgrounds with Cora rather than standing idle near the dairy hall, if only to keep herself from returning every 10 minutes to hover outside the door the way 2 or 3 of the more anxious entrants plainly were. They watched the harness races for a while from the rail along the track, the dust rising gold in the late afternoon light, and Cora bought them each a cup of cider from a stand run by a church group raising money for a new bell. And neither woman said much, because there was not much useful left to say about a decision that now rested entirely with Barnabas Careless and his small leather notebook. The results were posted at 4 o'clock on a board propped against the exhibition hall's outer wall, and Tempy stood in a small crowd of farm families waiting for the dairy superintendent's assistant to pin up the printed cards, feeling, despite every effort to keep herself level, something very close to the nervousness she remembered from standing in the trampled dooryard 4 months before with 6 coins in her hand. The fresh butter class went, that year, to a well-regarded dairy family from the far side of the county, a decision nobody in the hall disputed, their butter having been judged, fairly enough, the finest single pound tasted on the day itself. It was the keeping butter class, the harder test, the one that mattered most for exactly the reason Tempy had built her whole enterprise around, that drew the crowd's real attention, because everyone standing in that hall understood in a plain, practical way that a household's real dairy fortune through a hard summer rested not on which butter tasted best fresh on a Tuesday morning, but on which butter still tasted good a full week later, after sitting through the same brutal heat that had ruined half the county's cellars that July. Barnabas Careless himself read the results aloud rather than simply posting them, a habit of his that the crowd had come to expect and rather enjoy, and when he announced that the blue ribbon and the society's cash premium of $2 for the finest keeping butter entered that year went to the firkin marked with a sheaf of wheat entered by Mrs. Temperance Fuller of the old Alcock Spring lot, there was a beat of genuine surprise audible in the hall before the applause started. Farm wives who knew her only by the story of the Springhouse looking at each other, and somewhere near the back of the room Newell Bragg's face, Tempy noticed without quite meaning to look for it, had gone entirely still. Careless himself sought her out afterward, pressing the blue ribbon into her hand along with $2 silver counted out from the society's small strongbox, and told her plainly, in front of enough onlookers, that the remark was certain to travel through the county inside the week, that in 11 years of judging he had rarely tasted a weak-held firkin sample that had lost so little of its fresh sweetness, and that whatever cellar she was keeping it in, she ought never to change it. Tempy thanked him with a composure that cost her considerably more effort than it appeared to, and walked back out into the August sunlight past the Bragg firkin, sitting on the trestle table with a plain white card marked simply and without comment, no ribbon pinned beside it at all. The ride back from Burton that evening was slower than the ride out, the wagon heavier with empty crates, and both women worn through from a day spent standing on trampled grass in the August heat. And Tempy found herself somewhere past the halfway mark, turning the blue ribbon over in her hands in the fading light, running her thumb along its stitched edge the way she might once have run a thumb along the seam of the fieldstone walls the week Ezra first showed her the ruin was sound. She decided, watching the last of the daylight go gold and then gray over the ridge, that she would nail it, plainly and without ceremony, to the inside of the Springhouse door, where she alone would see it each morning rather than anywhere a visitor might mistake the gesture for boasting. Ezra said little the whole ride, as was his habit, but he pulled the wagon up at her gate with a small, satisfied nod that told her, better than any speech could have, exactly what he thought of the day's outcome, and he refused when she offered to take a single cent beyond what they'd already agreed for driving her there and back. The $2 and the blue ribbon were, by any honest accounting, the smallest part of what the fare produced for her, because standing near the dairy hall door as the crowd dispersed that afternoon was Otis Farrow, steward of the Exchange House Hotel in Churn, a stout, sharp-eyed man who kept the largest dining room between the county seat and the lake, supplied with whatever fresh provisions his own careful judgment could locate, and who had, it turned out, tasted both classes of entries himself before the judging even closed, on the theory that a hotel steward's palate ought to trust itself as readily as any society judge's. He introduced himself to Tempy directly, without much preamble, and asked whether the ribbon-winning firkin represented a batch she could reliably reproduce week after week through the rest of the summer, because the exchange house, he explained, served 3 meals a day to travelers and county visitors who expected butter that tasted the same in September as it had in June. And he had, in 11 years running that dining room, rarely been able to promise them exactly that. Tempy told him what she had told Ansel Deems in June, plainly and without apology, that she could supply him a standing order at a price she would name once and not haggle over afterward, because a woman keeping honest ledgers on both sides of an arrangement had no patience left for negotiating the same number twice. Pharaoh, who had clearly expected to do the naming of the price himself, studied her for a moment with an expression that Cora Whitfield, standing nearby, later described to Tempy as a man recalculating an assumption in real time, and asked what figure she had in mind. She named 30 cents a pound for stamped prints delivered twice weekly, 4 cents above what Deems was already paying her, on the reasoning that a hotel dining room paid for reliability the way a general store paid for quality, and that the exchange house's reputation depended on hers holding steady through a full county season. Pharaoh did not haggle. 30 cents, he repeated, as if testing the weight of it, and then put his hand out. Done, provided it stays what I tasted today. He explained, walking with her a short way from the dairy hall while Ezra brought the wagon around, that the exchange house had lost 2 cooks in as many years, partly over disputes about spoiled provisions reaching his kitchen without warning, and that a supplier who told him the plain truth about a failed batch, the way Tempy had told Deems back in June, was worth more to him than a supplier who simply hoped he wouldn't notice. I'd rather hear bad news early than good news I can't trust, he said, and Tempy thought, walking back to the wagon afterward, that it was very nearly the same principle she had built the whole Springhouse operation on, without ever putting it into quite those words herself. He shook her hand on the spot, in front of enough of the dispersing fairground crowd that the story of the widow Fuller naming her own price to the exchange house steward and getting it without argument had, by Tempy's own later reckoning, reached every household on the creek road before she herself made it home that evening. Within the same week, word of the fair ribbon and the hotel contract together brought a third buyer up her own lane unbidden, a produce dealer from the lake road named Silas Court, who supplied smaller stores along the shipping route between Chardon and Fairport, and who offered, sight unseen beyond what he'd already heard, to take whatever surplus firkin butter she could spare beyond her standing orders at 28 cents a pound, a price Tempy accepted only after making him wait a full day for her answer. On the theory, which she noted with some private satisfaction in the marbled ledger that evening, that a woman who let herself be caught eager lost the very advantage that had gotten her the offer in the first place. Court mentioned, almost as an afterthought as he was climbing back onto his wagon, that a Cleveland grocer he supplied twice a month had been asking after keeping butter that could survive a longer haul without turning, and that he'd be glad to carry a sample along on his next run if she cared to send one, a remark Tempy filed away in the back of her mind without answering either way, since she had already learned that season that a woman did better to grow into an opportunity than to reach for one before she had the volume to fill it honestly. There came a Saturday morning in late August when the tension the title alone might have promised finally became visible in the flesh, standing in her own dooryard. Otis Farrow's boy had ridden out early to collect the exchange house's twice-weekly order, and he was still loading the wrapped prints into his saddlebags when Silas Court's wagon came up the lane behind him, the produce dealer having arrived a day earlier than his usual schedule specifically because, he admitted without much embarrassment, He'd heard from a farmer on the main road that her supply that week ran shorter than usual, 4 of her milking cows having gone dry within days of each other, and he wanted to be certain he wasn't left short himself. The 2 of them stood in her dooryard doing arithmetic in front of her, Pharaoh's boy insisting the exchange house's standing order took precedence by right of the written contract, Court countering that he'd ridden a full day out of his ordinary circuit and didn't intend to go home with an empty wagon, and Tempy, watching the 2 of them argue over a shortfall of perhaps 11 pounds, found the whole scene almost comical, remembering an April dooryard where the only argument had been about whether she'd wasted her last $6. She settled it herself, plainly, the way she settled most things by then. The exchange house's contracted order filled first and in full, because a written agreement was a written agreement, and whatever remained divided fairly by what each man could use, with Court promised first claim on the following week's surplus as recompense for the inconvenience. Neither man argued with the ruling once she'd given it, and Court, climbing back onto his wagon with less than he'd hoped for, remarked to her, not entirely as a joke, that he'd never in 15 years of hauling produce watched 2 buyers stand in a farmyard arguing over a widow's butter, and that he supposed he'd best get used to it if her Springhouse kept on the way it was going. Word of the morning traveled the length of the creek road within the week, embellished, as township stories always were, into something closer to a genuine standoff than the brief, good-natured arithmetic it had actually been. But the essential fact underneath the embellishment held true well enough. The same buyers who had once needed courting now competed, openly and at her own gate, for whatever she had left to sell, at the price she had named and never once lowered. Newell Bragg came up Tempy's lane himself in the 3rd week of August, on a Tuesday afternoon when she was hanging washed cheesecloth to dry on a line strung between the Springhouse door and the old chestnut fence post. And he stood at the gate for a long moment before he said anything at all, which was, Tempy reflected afterward, about as close to an apology as a man of his particular pride was ever likely to manage. He had lost, he told her, without quite meeting her eyes, the better part of his July dairy income to spoiled batches, had been forced to buy ice at a ruinous price from a dealer 2 townships over just to salvage what remained of the month, and had, on top of all that, heard from 3 separate sources that his hired girl's own mother had begun buying Fuller butter at Deem's counter, rather than trust the dairy her own daughter worked in. He asked, with a directness that plainly cost him something, whether Tempy would take his cream on shares the way she took Cora Whitfield's and Ruth Kessler's on whatever terms she thought fair, because his own cellar, ice or no ice, had proven itself unequal to a hard summer in a way the old Alcock spring lot apparently never would be. Tempy considered him for a long moment, remembering the sound of his laughter carried on the April wind, and the remark he'd made outside the Chardon feed store in June, and told him in the same level voice that had answered him in the dooryard 4 months before, that she would take his cream on the standard arrangement, 2 parts to him and 1 to her. The same terms every household on the creek road already worked under, no better and no worse, because a fair trade was a fair trade whoever brought the cream to her door. Bragg agreed without argument, shook her hand across the gate rail in a gesture that seemed to surprise them both a little, and rode away with considerably less to say than he had arrived with. Managing 7 households' cream on a fixed schedule was, by early September, a considerably more complicated undertaking than skimming her own single cow's milk had ever been. And Tempy had taken to keeping a chalked board nailed just inside the Springhouse door listing which household's cream was due on which morning, how long each crock had been ripening, and which shelf it occupied, because trusting the whole arrangement to memory, she had decided after one near mix-up in August, was exactly the kind of shortcut that had cost her a batch back in June. She staggered the household's delivery days deliberately, Cora and the Kesslers on Mondays and Thursdays, the Pettibones and the Sump cow's modest contribution folded into whichever churning had room for it, and Bragg's considerably larger volume given its own dedicated Wednesday and Saturday, churning entirely separate from the smaller households, so that no single day's batch ever grew too large for her to wash and work with the same unhurried thoroughness the June disaster had taught her to insist on, however much cream was waiting. By the time the first real cool nights of September came down off the ridge, Tempy was receiving cream on shares from 7 households along the creek road. Bragg's 40 cows contributing more volume in a single delivery than all her original 4 households combined, and she had begun, at Ezra Colt's quiet suggestion, sketching plans in the margins of her ledger for a second stone shelf and a wider spring trough, because the Springhouse that had stood empty and laughed at in April could no longer comfortably hold, by September, the volume of cream the whole neighborhood now trusted her to turn into butter that kept. She sat down on the last evening of September with both ledgers open on the kitchen table by lamplight, the household accounts and the separate marbled book she'd kept faithfully since the day of the sale, and ran the whole season's figures from the beginning the way she had once run her father's accounts as a girl, refusing herself any comfortable rounding. Against the $6 paid at the estate sale for 2 ruined acres, a caved-in Springhouse, a cracked churn, and 4 chipped crocks, she set $9.40 spent through May on lime cedar shakes, tin pans, and nails, $1.50 on 6 white ash firkins from the Chardon Cooper, 80 cents on 2 carved butter prints, and a running total of salt, cheesecloth, and small repairs that came, all told across the whole season, to just under $14 spent beyond her original purchase. Against that outlay of not quite $20 total, she set the season's income, entering each figure in the same careful upright hand. Deems's standing order at 26 cents a pound through July and August, some $91 by her careful count. The exchange house contract with Otis Farrow at 30 cents a pound, running to just over $68 since the fair. The Lake Road produce dealer's purchases of surplus firkin butter, another $31, the $2 fair premium, and her own third share returns from 7 households cream on top of everything already counted, which she valued conservatively in the ledger at what she would have paid to buy that much butter outright. Another $40-some she had never actually handled as coin, but which represented, just as truly, wealth the Springhouse itself had generated. The total, entered in her own careful upright hand at the bottom of the marbled ledger's September page, came to $232 and some odd cents earned or fairly valued against $14 spent on top of the original 6, in the 5 months since a county estate agent had folded 6 silver coins into his ledger book while a dooryard full of men laughed at what she'd bought with them. Reading back through the marbled ledger's earlier pages that same evening, she could trace the whole shape of the season in numbers alone. 2 pounds of butter and no cash at all by the 3rd week of May, 4 pounds a week by the start of June, the sickening 0 entered against the ruined 15-pound order in the 2nd week of June, and then, week by careful week through the rest of the summer, the totals climbing without another interruption, 18 pounds a week by July, 26 by the 1st week of August, and better than 30 most weeks since the fair, as household after household along the creek road brought her their cream rather than trust it to a cellar that couldn't hold a summer's heat. It was not, she thought, looking at the steady climb of the figures, a fortune made in a single dramatic stroke, the way a man might win one at cards or strike it in a mine. It was a fortune assembled one correctly washed batch at a time, and she found she trusted it a good deal more for having been built that way. She sat with the final number a long while, turning the page back to April and reading in her own handwriting the plain entry she'd made the evening of the sale. $6, 2 acres, 1 Springhouse in ruins, 1 cracked churn, 4 crocks. She had written nothing hopeful beside it that night, no note of what she meant the ruin to become, only the bare figures because she had learned young that hope written down in a ledger was worth exactly nothing until the arithmetic underneath it proved sound, and she found, reading it now beside the September total, a quiet satisfaction in having proven it sound herself, one careful, unglamorous week at a time. She thought, closing the ledger and sitting a while longer in the lamplight, of Prudence Alcock, dead and settled and mostly forgotten by a township that had let her Springhouse cave in under 2 winters of snow, rather than remember what the old woman had actually known. And she thought that the finest tribute she could pay a dead dairywoman she'd never properly met was simply to keep doing, faithfully and without shortcuts, exactly what Prudence Alcock's cold spring had always been capable of if anyone had troubled to notice it. She thought, too, briefly, and without the sharp grief it would once have carried, of Amos, who had never lived to see the Springhouse or taste a single pound of the butter that now carried her stamped mark to 3 separate counties' worth of tables, and who would have said, she believed, in his own quiet way, that a woman who could turn $6 and a dead woman's ruin into 232 had never really needed anyone's permission to make her own way in the world. She was already turning her mind, that same evening, toward the winter ahead, when fresh grass butter grew scarce, and the price at Deem's counter always climbed as households fell back on whatever they'd packed away in brine-topped firkins through the summer months, and she had set aside deliberately the dozen best firkins from her strongest late-season batches specifically to hold back for the lean months, reckoning that butter she could sell in January at a winter premium was worth considerably more sitting patiently in her cellar than butter sold in a hurry come September. She was planning, too, with Ezra Colt's help and Cora Whitfield's steady friendship, to widen the Springhouse before the next season's grass came in, to add a second churn and take on an extra pair of hands for the busiest mornings, and she had already spoken quietly to Cora about whether her eldest niece, a capable girl of 16 named Lucy and looking for honest work, might come learn the trade properly the following spring, so that the knowledge Annalie Sump had carried forward from a dead woman's kitchen table would not this time be allowed to die with any single pair of hands again. She rode down to speak with Cora directly about it the following Sunday, laying out plainly what she could offer. $2 a month through the churning season, her keep on the days she worked, and more than the wage itself, a genuine apprenticeship in a trade Tempy meant to see carried forward properly this time, taught deliberately rather than left to survive in fragments the way Prudence Alcock's knowledge nearly hadn't. Lucy agreed before her aunt had finished relaying the offer, and Tempy found herself walking back up the lane that afternoon, turning over the strange, satisfying shape of the whole year. A widow who had stood alone and mocked in an April dooryard, now standing at the head of an operation large enough to need a second pair of trained hands. By the time the first frost came down hard enough to silver the pasture grass along the creek road, Temperance Fuller was no longer the widow who'd bought a hole in the ground for $6 and been laughed at for it in a trampled dooryard. She was the woman 7 households in the township now trusted with their cream twice a week, the supplier whose stamped print sat behind glass at Ansel Deem's counter with a hand-lettered card beside it reading simply, Fuller's Own. The name Otis Farrow gave without hesitation whenever a traveler at the exchange house asked what made the hotel's butter worth remarking on, and the standing example, spoken of now with considerably more respect than mockery along the length of the creek road, of what a cold spring and an honest reckoning of one's own mistakes could build out of ground. Everyone else had been glad to see her waste her money on. The fortune the old ruin had been quietly hiding under 2 winters of fallen roof timber had turned out to be considerably larger than anyone standing in that April dooryard, herself included, had ever quite imagined, and it had cost her, in the end, nothing more than $6, an honest failure owned and corrected, and the patience to let a cold spring do the one thing it had always been capable of doing. If a story like Temperance Fuller's is the kind you come back for, the kindest thing you can do is like this video and subscribe for the next one, and tell us in the comments what you think the $6 in the caved-in Springhouse were really worth once the county fair was through arguing about it. We'll read every answer, and we'll see you at the next auction.